Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Again, I'm very excited to bring you what we could call now part 2 of my conversation with Mac and Phil from Dimming the Gaslight. In this episode, we continue exploring vulnerable narcissism, focusing on the deeper motivations behind narcissistic behavior and the role that therapy plays in facilitating change. We discussed the need-fear dilemma that often keeps narcissistic individuals stuck, the challenge of forgiveness and moving forward, and how to recognize when it's time to separate from a narcissist. We also examine the profound impact of vulnerable narcissism on relationships, the concept of shared fantasy in toxic dynamics, and even the role of brain chemistry in narcissism. So as you could tell, we covered a lot. And again, that's why I divided it into part 1 and part 2. So let's dive right in. Here's part 2 of my conversation with the host of Dimming the Gaslight. And if you haven't checked out that podcast, I recommend that you do. I'll put the link in the show notes below. I hope you find this conversation as engaging, eye-opening, and thought-provoking as I did.
Okay, so you use cheating as an example. Let's stay with that, for example. When you say they perseverate and they want to stay on that topic of what if someone cheats, they're genuinely, horribly feel sad about it, and they're remorseful, you want to repent, you use the word repentance, and then what if it gets to a point where that person is so fixated, the offended person is so fixated on the wrong that was done to them, do they lose track of coming to a common ground in terms of getting the relationship back on track? You know? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Do they stop? You know what I mean? Or is it always about, I was cheated on, that person deserves to suffer?
Yeah.
I'm taking your example.
Yeah, I'm with you. I want to just answer the question by pointing something out. I'm not fully prepared to give this clinical example. Remember I said I always use like a composite example of this, but the composite example would look something like this. They would come in and they would say, oh, we fought again because he continues to betray me. And of course I brought up the cheating because you're still betraying me. And then I slow that down and I say, what was the betrayal today? Tell me what happened. And they would say, I was so upset about the cheating, I was crying in the bathroom. And he was outside the bathroom and he's saying, how can I be helpful? And I said something like, just go away, right? So I say to him, what do you do? I wanted to be there for her because that's what we've been going over in therapy. So I tried to be there and I said, I don't want to go in, but she kept insisting. So I thought maybe I should give her some space. So I left. And then when I came back to check on her a little bit later, she says, I cannot believe you left me. There it is again. You continued to betray me. He was like, you told me to go away. She said, but I never said leave. Right? And it's like, what is it that?
Yeah, you are so spot on. You are Sensei Counts 22.
Yeah, so I digressed into that to say, yes, Mac, there are 2 answers to your question. Sometimes these nuances, again, I know I keep going back to this word, but the subtleties of this stuff are so important. And when it's affectively alive and we're working with it, then now I could get closer to like with this woman. What was going on? What were you expecting would happen when you told him to leave or something like that, but you didn't mean for him to go? And what were you expecting? And what we slowly begin to unravel, and this is, again, just a little bit of psychoanalytic jargon, it's called the need-fear dilemma. In other words, there's a need to have somebody there, but it's a dilemma because you shouldn't have needs. Needs are objectionable, especially in people who are narcissistically disturbed. So you push the other person away, but when you push them away, the thing you need the most, you go without, and then you want it back again. So this stuff gets really complicated. And getting into the details, this is the stuff that we typically see. So that's number 1. But number 2, to your point, Mac, and I think this is what you were getting after, it is true that sometimes people are it takes a lot to have a capacity for forgiveness and to move forward with one's life. And not everybody can do that. because maybe there were earlier betrayals in their life that get re-evoked with this betrayal. And then they're just too determined on replicating, reenacting earlier traumatic experiences that have never been put to rest. But the only difference is now they're doing it with you, Mac, instead of with the original person who hurt them.
I hear what you're saying, but okay, so I feel like a quote unquote normal, healthy person sees repentance or remorse or whatever words you want to use, and they show mercy because they know that feeling of, I feel bad for what I've done, and the offended party will let them off the hook. You know what I'm saying? And I feel like with a narcissist, that trigger is almost turned off, and they don't see remorse as weakness. They want to just keep piling on.
Yeah, and that's where the work comes in, because then you need to help them begin to understand that they're determined to have a certain image of you in mind and have that replicated. So no matter what you do at that moment, even if you're turning over your phone, whenever you go out for drinks with your friends, Mac, you share your location, or maybe you check in, you do all the things that are very sensitive in a relationship after you've betrayed somebody, but yet they continue to drill and dig into you, right? Then that's another story. Now we have a whole nother storyline we need to pursue, which is the story of revenge.
Yeah.
Wow. That's deep.
That's
Where it gets deeper and more complicated. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's assuming, just so you know, I just want to make this point clear, that not inadvertently, Mac, and I say inadvertently because you may not even realize it, that you're still not betraying her in little ways every day. That's why I gave that example of like outside the bathroom crying situation I mentioned.
Yeah, that was a great example.
Yeah.
very good. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's super potent. Back your speech so a while.
You can see the wheels on Phil and my head turning right now. Like, we talk to a lot of people and we hear a lot of situations, and you understand we have no clinical background. Like, there's certain things that stump us that we think this is such a valuable episode for listeners.
Yeah, and when in doubt for your listeners, if they don't have somebody like what you and I are doing right now to show like the different iterations of this, at the very least, here's a 5-second takeaway. If this is really happening, Mac, and they're listening to this and then they go back and there's this situation, they could just say, hey, I'm a little confused. What's going on right now? Is this really about the affair again, or is it about something else? And if they're like, no, this is just about the affair, they could say, I think this is more complicated. Maybe we could put our heads together and think about why it's so necessary for you to continue to see me as making no progress, because that's what you keep claiming. But yesterday, you felt pretty good when I was checking in with you. Remember that? When I was with my friends and we were out and you really were sending all those emojis of hearts and everything. So what's happening today? See, you can always do that if you yourself feel regulated. You see what I mean by that, guys? Then you're playing the role of stepping back and helping them engage a more reflective capacity, but only if you don't feel like under assault. Like, even though you are being attacked, then you have to have some ability to step back and help them begin to reflect, if that makes sense.
I feel like situations like that would be very difficult to not feel attacked, especially when you're clearly under assault. I feel like it'd be very difficult.
Yeah, but if you really have nothing to hide, though, Phil,
Correct.
and you are being transparent, that usually makes it a little bit easier, because you could feel sanguine about the fact that you're doing everything that most people, like Max said before, most people would respond to, which then suggests that there's more here than meets the eye that we need to get into.
Which kind of turns into at that point, the revenge narrative. Say that's something that's gone on for, 3 years, 4 years.
Yes.
And it's still getting brought up weekly or things like that.
Oh, there's no doubt. I would even say after 9 months to a year, if this is still coming up, then there's something else. Yes, there's definitely something else going on here.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the other thing is, let's pretend we're the offending party, okay? If we're the offending party, I also recognize that we don't get to put a time frame on someone else's forgiveness or recovery. I feel like that would be super disingenuous.
So so as the offending party, you can't just be like, why aren't you over this already? It's been 3 years. It's been 3 years. I've done everything I can, right?
Oh, so I think you could do that. By the way, I think you could do that, guys. But I'm sorry. I know I'm going against the grain here a little bit.
That's fine.
That's all you got. If it's been 3 years in my analytic mind, I'm beginning to say, this is not about the affair anymore. I'm sorry. This is not about the affair. This is about something more complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess it depends on the magnitude of the offense. But okay, so let me ask you this. And we're coming to the end of the hour here, but this might be my final question. Let's say, at what point do you know that it might be time to separate from a vulnerable narcissist? And what's your best advice for trying to do that?
At what point, if you feel like all the things that we've been going over, yeah, this is a good way to end the episode, right? Because we could pull things together now, right?
Yeah.
If you genuinely feel, and maybe even with an outside observer, like a therapist or someone who's specifically trained in this area, that you have tried to repair the damage, all the stuff that I mentioned before, I didn't use the word containing, but containing, validating, trying to make the repair, giving your phone, whatever it is, all the things we spoke about, and nothing is changing, and that you're genuinely there for them. And you even try that higher level thing that I just mentioned, thinking about other representations, like how they're seeing you, and getting help, and still nothing is changing. Yeah, then that's up to you to determine your own level of tolerance for this stuff. Because some people have more tolerance. And even though, Mac, you could say, look, nothing is changing, but someone can say, we have kids or we have a life together. And if that means every month that I come under some kind of attack like this, I can contain that. I can live with that. That's understandable. She's having a hard time moving on, or he's having a hard time moving on.
Mm-hmm.
Your question is a complicated one, but the short answer would be, it depends on your own frustration level, like tolerance, on how much of this you can endure.
Yeah, how much of this is affecting you.
Yeah.
And if it's shifting your quality of life to a degree where you're becoming more unstable, then yeah, absolutely. I think it's not just that, right? It's a mixture of everything, right? Like if your sleeping pattern is getting disrupted, if this is happening and that's happening, it's all like building and coming to a head. Or with the vulnerable narcissist, I wish there was different angles I wanted to go into that with you that we didn't even really get to. But even on that, it's almost, I feel like, from what it feels like, you almost become like a parent or a caretaker with a vulnerable narcissist. And I actually did a little research on my own too, digging into it a little bit and looking at all the different physical and medical side effects. And it almost reminded me to a degree of some of these vulnerable narcissists that I was like getting examples of, almost leaning into, what is it? The syndrome when you feel like you have something, but you don't. Like
Munchausen's.
Almost, where it's like, or manifesting physical ailments because of the stressors they put on themselves or whatever void they're trying to fill with other things, to where they're getting chronic headaches or migraines or insomnia, depression, suicidal thoughts, like things like that, or eating disorders even, which I believe could probably be more than just a vulnerable narcissist. But I feel like the vulnerable narcissist would really lean into that, really lean into the martyrdom, the victimhood of their previous traumas, and say, oh, because of all these traumas of my childhood, I now have this and I now have that. You need to take care of me. Please, I need you. But then when you're there for them, I guess I'm saying this out loud to see if you agree or not. I'm rambling. You can cut me off at any point.
You're not rambling. I'm following every word you're saying. You're not rambling.
But it just blew my mind going down this rabbit hole with the vulnerable narcissist and all the different ways that I feel like we're used to certain types. And so if you come across a type like this, they can seem harmless. They can just seem like another thing to help. It's another person you can help. And I feel like a lot of people that are empaths and things like that, it's their nature to want to help. And so I could definitely see how a vulnerable narcissist you could get pulled into a relationship with a vulnerable narcissist just off your kind spirit and wanting to help.
Okay, so this is a beautiful place for us to begin to wrap it up, because it brings what Mac just said about at what point would you consider leaving somebody or leaving this type of relationship. Mac, that's what you were asking. And Phil, what you're getting at is something about what makes it difficult to leave this type of relationship, right? Because many people can now identify that maybe they're with somebody who has these narcissistic characteristics, like this vulnerability that we're describing. Mm-hmm. But it's incredibly difficult for some people to leave this type of relationship. So that's a whole piece we need to discuss. But the short answer to it is, you said like they're mothering the vulnerable narcissist, which is absolutely true. So in the literature, there's something, the psychoanalytic literature calls it, there's a different name for this, but in the more contemporary social media literature, it's called a shared fantasy. So the shared fantasy is in the mothering of somebody who has vulnerable narcissistic characteristics, because they become like a baby almost, right? When you become like the mother, there is something incredibly gratifying about that. As much as you may complain about it, that you want your partner or your adult child to be more independent, you cannot bear for them to be more independent. And it's so paradoxical that it's mind-boggling. One of the reasons for this, according to this theory, is that there's this shared fantasy, and there's an immense level of gratification that you two are getting from being in this type of toxic relationship.
Ooh.
Yeah. So that's a whole nother avenue we could go down, Phil, at some point if we ever want to do a part 2 to this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
And
You
then
should.
if they do get out, and this happens with many people, I hear a lot of these stories, either they end up in a relationship that's very similar, and they say, oh, what a coincidence. I just happened to find somebody. I must attract these people who has these similar characteristics. Or alternatively, they end up back with the person that they left. So that's like another segment of like, why can't they get out? And once they do get out, why is it so difficult to stay out and really move forward with their life in a healthy way?
Yeah.
Anyway, I just set our agenda for part 2 if we decide.
There you go. Stepped it up. That was awesome. So we did have a couple questions. I feel from guests, we did mention that. I know we got to wrap this up. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But I feel like one of the questions maybe we've answered in a way. We did have a question from Taylor that was asking about, I guess we didn't really answer that one. I mean, there are a couple questions. I don't know. Do you think we have time to go over those?
I'm here and I have time, but I don't have the clock. So I think, Mac, maybe you're in charge.
We're good. Just keep going. No, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah. As long as we have the time, I'm okay on the time right now too. We did have a question from Taylor when we said that we were going to be speaking to you. And he did ask about narcissists in general, more of a general question about, is it something in the brain that makes them the way they are, basically? Or is it a choice that they make? Or is it something that's just subconscious? So conditioning. Yeah.
This is really a great and important question, because oftentimes, again, when I listen to social media content, they love to go back to brain chemistry. But in my opinion, while this is helpful to know, remember before I said it's really important to have a theory in mind, because theory then dictates technique. And what I mean by technique, I'm thinking like from the mind of a practitioner, but how you relate to somebody like this to move forward in the relationship. But in terms of brain chemistry, there is a theory out there that talks about the dopamine, that's the reward system in the mind.
Right.
And how being in this type of relationship with a narcissistically disturbed individual, you intermittently get these bumps in dopamine, and you get these bumps when you feel this sense of togetherness. And this goes back, Phil, to what I said we would need to get into with the shared fantasy at some point. So I'm just giving a very quick hello to answer this question. But the answer is, yes, there are certain theories out there that have to do with the reward system in the mind, the dopamine that's necessary in order to get this bump, this kind of high. And that's why these relationships have been compared to an addiction, actually. I don't know if you've ever heard that. But an addiction gives you an immediate high as well. But in my own bias, my biased opinion is, I think we need to understand why certain people are more susceptible to this dopamine rush, because not everybody gets pulled into these kinds of relationships. And then you need a theory for that as well, which we could talk about. But again, that may take us too far away. But yes, so dopamine, chemicals, and the one thing that's consistent through both theories, whether it's a chemical or a biological theory or more of a psychoanalytical psychology theory, is in both of them, it's not your fault. It's not like they do this stuff intentionally or consciously, but that there's this sort of need for this kind of attention or this dopamine bump. And that's what they're looking to get to survive, because you need this literally to survive, because they're lacking it for many different reasons, again, which we'll save for future discussion.
Wow.
Does that help? I'm not sure if I addressed it. I get that.
I understand.
Yeah, I think it answered it. I really liked Amy's question. Amy asked a question here. I don't know really how to like fully word it, I guess the bottom line here of what her question is, especially because of social media and the discussion of awareness around like the dark triad, when it seems coming out more in different things, basically between social media, documentaries, different TV shows that are following these types of things. Do you think that just in your industry, when it comes to like psychologists and getting more educated on cluster B and on narcissism and being able to recognize it, obviously like Dr. Ramani is a big one in the community too, and she's doing a really good job spreading the word on all this as well. But I guess her question really is how's the education going as far as spreading awareness, and how well are we doing really on being able to recognize this from a psychological standpoint and really, I guess, diagnosing properly, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that we're making headway there?
I think that descriptively speaking, like you mentioned, Dr. Ramani, who does an amazing job describing the characteristics of these different clusters or types of narcissism, if we could call it that. I would just say which characteristics predominate. You remember, because remember I said even the most grandiose, like a Tony Soprano, also has the vulnerable piece, right?
Right.
So in that sense, wonderful. I think we're doing a wonderful job, or the people on social media are doing a wonderful job describing it. What I think is lacking is a good, strong theory to why they behave this way that goes beyond you had a traumatic upbringing and your parent was neglectful or abusive. That stuff doesn't really help. When you're with somebody and you reconstruct their childhood, they're like, all right, but like, how is that supposed to help me when my wife is attacking me? Something like that. So I think the place where we need to do a little bit more would be better sort of underlying theories. And here's the main thing, which you rarely ever hear in any of the content, is what's the treatment approach? Aside from journaling and creating boundaries, which drives me crazy, by the way, because it's such a superficial intervention.
Right.
How can we really intervene in a way if we have that interest in terms of keeping people together, if they want to stay together, or if they do separate? Being able to get out of that fantasy that we mentioned earlier, Phil, which we said would be a part 2, right? So they could not replicate or reenact this in their future relationships. So I think that's the part that's sorely missing, is the intervention and treatment part beyond creating boundaries, journaling, and the superficial, what I would consider pretty superficial intervention.
Do you think that there's like an uptick in just like being able to diagnose it in general, right? Because that's a big thing they always talk about, is they say, oh, only 1% of the world is a narcissist. Stop saying everyone's a narcissist, right? And then but realistically, it's such a difficult thing to diagnose. So you can't treat it if you can't diagnose it, because they're so good at the mask, right? So are we getting better at recognizing the mask and diagnosing properly? Because at this point, if there's 1 to 2%, whatever the percentage is, when realistically it could be closer to 5%, 10%. It could, who knows, right?
Yeah.
Like, we don't know, because the mask is so good at staying on, especially during therapy. Do you think that
I think it's got to be more than 1%. That's for sure.
Right? Are there new tactics, new techniques that are being? I just threw a percentage out there. 50% of percentages are make believe in anyway.
I got that joke. That was hilarious.
In terms of percentages, and I know you said you're just throwing it out there, but there is a big discrepancy in terms of percentages and regarding prevalence of NPD, because it really depends on who's diagnosing, right? Like, even they found that most clinicians who are not specifically trained in this area don't even have a good capacity to diagnose, and they miss it because of that mess that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And because of their great capacity to externalize the problem and always blame somebody else. And
they get misdiagnosed, right?
Yeah. So then the diagnosis goes missed. But then for people who are specifically trained, the percentage is all the way up to 16% they're reporting. 16% of their caseload come in and they have this diagnosis. So the only thing I would be careful of, and I'm glad you went back to this question, Phil, is it may actually, because we're learning so much about it, people may overly diagnose and say, oh, I'm calling about my narcissistic husband. And it's, oh, geez, are you sure he's a narcissist? And like, how do you know that? Because like I mentioned all the way at the beginning of this episode, it exists on the continuum. And there is actually something called healthy narcissism. And then where do you begin to differentiate between healthy narcissism and pathological narcissism? And what are some of the criteria that are necessary rather than just bullet points in the DSM?
Yeah.
So that gets a little nuanced and complicated.
I feel like we've said it a few times, but all of us have the capacity for having some key point of narcissism, right? I feel like everybody has their moments. Everybody has their moments of maybe a bullet point here or there. It's not like they stay on that like pathological, but everyone has their moments. And then usually we pull our head out of our ass and go, oh, you know what? I probably shouldn't have said that. And then we backtrack because we're normal. I'm sorry. I don't know if you had anything else to add to that. I only had one other question from Christina. Hopefully we can wrap it up here after that. Basically, she just said, I have a question. I've listened to the Self-Aware Narcissist on the show and everything, but she was curious about, can narcissists ever actually get enough help to stop manipulating people or hurting people, which I think we've already discussed a little bit. I don't know if we've already answered that question really through what we said, but
yeah, I think we did, because earlier you asked me, like, can they change? And I said, depends on the motivation, right? Their interest in changing and the motivation. And then if they get good quality help, I don't know if I mentioned that before, because sometimes you end up with a therapist who's not specifically trained with personality disorders. Mm-hmm. And then developing a capacity, what you just said, not to manipulate somebody, because you have to have empathy, not to manipulate. But to have empathy, you have to be able to establish what are called whole object relationships. I'm just borrowing a little jargon. But basically, that just means self-evident differentiation, which is somebody has a capacity to have a life of their own or an opinion of their own that's separate from yours. And even though you feel very strongly about it and you love them and they love you, that it's okay that they have a different opinion. So these things get a little complicated. But again, I just give you the short answer, as if this is like rapid fire now, right? The short answer is, yeah, of course, the motivation and interest is there and they're getting good quality help. Then yeah, They would definitely become less manipulative. Sure.
Definitely not easy. Probably forever. And it's going to be a work in progress forever. But it's possible to at least simmer it a little, push it down.
Little bits, that's right. Everything happens incrementally, little shifts at a time that take, and I'm glad you mentioned this, Phil, because it does take time. And that's the unfortunate part. But anything that's deeply embedded in our personality, if in fact it is NPD, is like a structure that develops within us. And structures are like, it's like a slow process of change. So it does take time, for sure.
I feel like, I think I've mentioned this when she asked me that question. I said, I feel like the ones that probably have a better success rate of changing are the ones that are diagnosed properly and the ones that accept that. But because then then they can go around and say, hey, look at me, I'm a narcissist. And doesn't that kind of feed into their like, poor me, I have a mental disorder in a way to where then they can get the supply in a different way. But I'm trying to change, but now this is my personality. And I feel in a way, it's like still playing into that like victimhood mentality, but at the same time, like they recognize it and they really do want to change because they don't want to manipulate people. And it does help with the change, but I feel like it's also like still feeding that ego that they need, or that, like you said, dopamine hit in a certain way to get attention.
The way you described it, Phil, it's like they hijack the diagnosis, right?
I know.
That they're using it now. Yeah. It's like that story we were going back and forth with before earlier, Mac. Remember when I said there's more here than meets the eye? Maybe this is about revenge now. It's like there's more to the story if they're going around using the diagnosis in that particular way. Yeah.
We're coming to the end of the hour. Can you tell everybody where they can find you, where they can find your podcast and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, if you don't mind putting it in your show notes, but it's very simple. If they just go to drmazzella.com, it's just drmazzella, M-A-Z-L-A.com. Everything is there. That's my website. The podcast is there. The video channel is there. And any content I put out, it's all on the website. So thanks. Yeah, thanks for that, Mark.
Perfect. Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. I think I speak for Phil as well when I say I definitely think we should do a part 2.
Yeah, that'd be great. Hey, listen, this was a lot of fun on my end too, just so your listeners know. Before we went live, I was like, I had some notes prepared, but I couldn't get them up. And it was a little, and you're like, we'll just have fun and like kind of wing it. And I'll tell you guys are awesome. This was a lot of fun. I felt really comfortable talking to you. It flowed very naturally. So yeah, I'd be happy to come back anytime you like. So thank you.
Yeah. Also, yeah, we take pride in just getting organic reactions, even when we're telling personal stories. We're the best of friends, but we'll be like, I'm not telling you this story until I get live on the air. I want to get your genuine reaction. And we do that all the time. Anyway, Stay in touch with us. We absolutely appreciate you being on this episode. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks again, guys.
All right, until next time.
Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.